Before you scroll away, ask yourself this. Could one simple act of kindness really be worth $43 million? Margaret believed the freezing winter night she offered a homeless teenager a hot meal, a safe place to sleep, and a few comforting words was nothing more than a forgotten memory. 28 years later, 3 attorneys arrived at her door with an unbelievable inheritance and a final letter that would reveal a truth so heartbreaking and inspiring. It changed everything. This unforgettable story of kindness, unexpected inheritance, second chances, and gratitude proves that the smallest act of compassion can create a legacy beyond anything you could ever imagine. Stay with us until the end, because the final revelation is the reason millions of people have never forgotten this story. 3 black SUVs crawled down the narrow gravel road as if they already knew exactly where they were going. They didn't belong here. Not in Silver Creek, Colorado, a forgotten mountain town where the biggest excitement was usually the mail truck arriving before noon. Their polished paint reflected the pale winter sunlight, their tinted windows hiding whoever sat inside. They looked less like visitors and more like people arriving to change someone's life forever. Every curtain on the street moved. Neighbors stopped sweeping porches. An old man watering his chickens lowered the hose and simply stared. Because everyone knew the little white farmhouse at the end of the road belonged to Margaret Collins. And everyone also knew Margaret had nothing left worth taking. At 69 years old, she lived alone on a fixed Social Security check that barely covered groceries, medicine, and the property taxes she was already months behind on. The roof leaked whenever snow melted too quickly. Her furnace coughed through every winter like it was begging to retire. She patched broken windows with clear tape because replacing them wasn't an option. People in town quietly helped whenever they could. Someone left firewood on her porch every November. Another neighbor shoveled her driveway after every storm. Nobody ever made a big deal about it, because Margaret would never ask for help. Not once. Inside the house. She stood at the kitchen sink, washing the same coffee mug she'd already cleaned twice. Her hands weren't as steady as they used to be. Arthritis made simple things painful now. Still, she refused to complain. Life had already taken enough from her. Her husband, her business, almost every dream she'd ever built. She wasn't interested in asking life for anything else. Then she heard tires crunch across the gravel. She glanced through the kitchen window. Her heart nearly stopped. 3 black SUVs. 4 men. Expensive suits. Leather briefcases. For one terrifying second, only one thought entered her mind. They've finally come to take the house. She quietly reached toward the kitchen table where unopened county letters had been piling up for months. Property tax notices. Insurance reminders. Repair citations. She hadn't opened the latest one. She already knew she couldn't afford whatever it said. The knock came slowly. Not angry. Not impatient. Almost respectful. She hesitated. Another knock. Then silence. Margaret took a deep breath before unlocking the front door just enough to peek outside. The man standing closest removed his sunglasses. He looked to be in his early 50s. Professional. Calm. His expression carried something she couldn't quite recognize. It wasn't authority. It wasn't pity. It looked strangely like gratitude. Mrs. Margaret Collins. She nodded carefully. I haven't been called Mrs. since my husband passed. The man lowered his head slightly. My apologies. Then his voice became unexpectedly soft. I only need to ask you one question. Margaret tightened her grip on the doorknob. His next sentence shattered nearly 3 decades of silence. Do you remember the winter of 1998? And a homeless teenage boy carrying an old violin? Everything inside her stopped. The cold breeze, the sound of birds, even her breathing. 28 years vanished. She wasn't standing in her farmhouse anymore. She was back inside her tiny roadside cafe, watching snow fall outside the windows while a frightened teenager stood just inside the entrance. His coat was soaked. His boots leaked water. His lips had turned blue from the cold. He didn't ask for charity. He didn't ask for money. He simply lowered his eyes and whispered, "I'll wash dishes. I'll clean your kitchen. I'll fix whatever's broken. I just need something to eat." Margaret had looked into that young face and seen something she prayed no mother would ever see. A person who had almost given up believing tomorrow mattered. She fed him. She found an old cot in the storage room. She told him he could stay until the snowstorm passed. Nothing more, at least. That's what she had believed. She never asked his last name. Never expected to see him again. Never imagined the frightened boy sleeping beside boxes of canned vegetables would someday become one of the most celebrated musicians in America. Never imagined he would spend decades searching for the woman who had unknowingly saved his life. The attorney slowly opened his leather briefcase. Inside rested a thick, cream-colored envelope, its edges worn slightly with age. Across the front, written in elegant handwriting that had clearly been traced with extraordinary care, were just 4 words. For Margaret Collins? The attorney held the envelope with both hands, as though it contained something priceless. Then he looked directly into her eyes. "He searched for you for more than 20 years. He never stopped. He left strict instructions that this letter could only be placed into your hands." Margaret felt her knees weaken. She had no idea that one simple meal, one warm bed, and one conversation on a freezing winter night had quietly become the beginning of a story that millions of people already knew. Without realizing it had always started with her, Margaret couldn't bring herself to touch the envelope. Not yet. Her eyes remained fixed on the familiar handwriting, as though staring long enough might somehow reveal the face she'd never expected to see again. "Finally," she whispered. Who was he?" The attorney exchanged a glance with the 3 men standing behind him. For a moment, no one spoke. Then he reached into his briefcase and carefully removed a large framed photograph. He placed it gently on the kitchen table. Margaret leaned forward. The picture showed a man standing beneath blinding stage lights, a violin resting against his shoulder as more than 50,000 fans stretched into the darkness behind him. The stadium looked endless. Fireworks exploded overhead. His name glowed across giant screens. But Margaret never noticed the crowd. She only saw his eyes. The same quiet eyes. The same lonely expression. Older now. Wiser. But unmistakably the same young man who had once stood trembling inside her little cafe. Her breath caught. "It can't be." The attorney smiled softly. "It is. His name was Ethan Walker." Margaret covered her mouth. "I've heard his music." She shook her head in disbelief. "Oh, Lord. I've heard his songs for years. They play them on the radio. I never knew." The attorney nodded. "He never told the public your name. He wanted to protect your privacy. He always referred to you as the woman who reminded me I was worth saving." Margaret closed her eyes. A single tear slipped down her cheek. She remembered that frightened teenager apologizing every time he accepted another bowl of soup. She remembered him fixing broken cabinet hinges without being asked. She remembered waking one morning to discover he'd repaired the cafe's old furnace because he didn't want her spending money she didn't have. He had never acted like someone expecting charity, only someone desperately trying to earn the kindness he was receiving. The attorney reached for a tablet. "I'd like you to hear something." He pressed play. A soft violin melody filled the tiny farmhouse. Within seconds, Margaret recognized it. Everyone in America recognized it. The song had comforted grieving families. Played at weddings, funerals, military memorials, hospital rooms. Millions had cried while listening to it. She had cried listening to it herself. But today she wasn't hearing the music. She was hearing something else, a familiar sentence, one she'd spoken almost 3 decades earlier while wiping coffee cups after closing time. The singer's voice echoed gently through the room. The ones we lose never really leave. They become the kindness we choose. Margaret's eyes flew open. No. The next lyric came, almost word for word. Love doesn't disappear. It simply learns a new way to stay. The coffee mug slipped from her trembling fingers. It shattered across the kitchen floor. No one moved. No one spoke. Margaret wasn't looking at the broken pieces. She was staring into the past. She could see herself sitting across from a scared 18-year-old who couldn't finish writing a song. He had buried his face in his hands. I know what I feel, he'd said. I just don't know how to say it. She remembered placing her hand over his. You don't lose the people you love. You carry them. They live in every good thing you choose to do. They become part of the person you decide to be. Back then, she had spoken those words because she desperately needed to believe them herself. She had lost her husband. She had lost hope. Those words weren't wisdom. They were survival. The music stopped. Silence settled over the room. The attorney quietly slid another document across the table. This is why we've come. Margaret adjusted her reading glasses. The paper looked old. Its edges had yellowed with time. Across the top were the words, United States Copyright Registration. Her eyes drifted downward, then suddenly stopped. Under the section labeled Songwriters, 2 names appeared. Ethan Walker. And beneath it, Margaret Collins. She blinked repeatedly, certain she had read it wrong. She looked again. Her name was still there. I've never written a song. The attorney's expression softened. You may not have written the melody, but you gave him the words that gave the melody its soul. He insisted your name remain beside his for the rest of his life. Margaret looked up in confusion. What are you talking about? The attorney slowly folded his hands. For 28 years. Every album sold. Every concert. Every movie license. Every radio broadcast. Every digital stream. Every performance around the world. He paused just long enough for the weight of his next sentence to settle. A percentage of every royalty has belonged to you. Margaret stared at him. Unable to breathe. Unable to think. She had spent years wondering whether she could afford medicine. Skipping meals so her heating bill could be paid. Watching every dollar disappear. Completely unaware that, somewhere in the world, a promise made by a grateful young musician had been waiting nearly 3 decades to find its way home. Margaret couldn't take her eyes off the copyright certificate. Her name, printed beside Ethan Walker's. It felt impossible, almost cruel. There had to be a mistake. There must be another Margaret Collins, she whispered, shaking her head. I never wrote lyrics. I never composed music. I only talked to a frightened boy one winter. The attorney gently slid the certificate closer. There was never another name. He refused to register the song without yours. He argued with every lawyer on his management team. They told him it wasn't legally necessary. He answered with one sentence. The attorney smiled faintly. Without her, there wouldn't have been a song. Margaret felt another tear escape before she could stop it. For nearly 30 years, she had believed that winter had disappeared into history. A forgotten memory? A few bowls of soup? An old storage room? One late-night conversation? Nothing more. But to Ethan, it had become the turning point of his entire life. The attorney opened another folder. Inside were dozens of photographs. Magazine covers. Concert posters. Award ceremonies. Grammy trophies. Television appearances. Magazine headlines from around the world. One headline immediately caught Margaret's attention. Ethan Walker's song saves lives during National Memorial. Another read, the anthem that helped a generation heal. Another, the story behind America's most comforting song remains a mystery. Margaret slowly ran her fingers across one photograph. Ethan stood backstage, smiling at a little girl wearing hearing aids. Another showed him visiting veterans recovering in military hospitals. Another showed him quietly performing inside a children's hospice. He never chased fame, the attorney explained. He chased people who needed hope. He believed music should leave someone stronger than it found them. Margaret smiled through her tears. That sounds like him. It is exactly who he became. The attorney reached for his tablet again. This time, I'd like to show you something very few people have ever seen. A video began playing. It wasn't a concert. It wasn't an interview. It looked like someone had recorded it inside a recording studio late at night. Ethan sat alone beneath a single lamp. His famous violin rested beside him. He looked older than in most television appearances. His hair carried streaks of gray. His voice was calm. If you're watching this. He began quietly. Then my attorneys finally found her. Margaret froze. Her hands instinctively reached toward the screen. Ethan smiled. I don't know how long it took. I don't know whether she's still running that little cafe. I don't even know if she remembers me. He laughed softly. I hope she does. His smile slowly disappeared. But if she doesn't, I remember enough for both of us. Margaret covered her mouth. The room had become completely silent. Even the attorneys lowered their eyes. Ethan continued. People always ask me where my biggest hit came from. They think it happened because I finally found the right melody. They're wrong. He looked directly into the camera. It happened because one exhausted widow looked at a homeless teenager and decided he was still worth feeding. Margaret couldn't stop crying now. The years she had spent believing she was invisible, believing her life no longer mattered, collapsed beneath those simple words. Ethan reached into his violin case. Carefully, almost reverently, from a hidden compartment, he removed something wrapped in protective plastic. A faded paper napkin? Its edges had turned yellow with age. The handwriting was rushed. Uneven. Some words had begun fading. I've carried this everywhere for 28 years, Ethan said. Every tour, every country, every recording session, every award ceremony. I was terrified I'd lose it. He unfolded it carefully. This, he smiled. Montueum. Is the night my life changed. The camera zoomed in. Margaret gasped. She recognized the restaurant logo printed in one corner. It was from her cafe. Every word written across that napkin had been copied from their conversation that snowy evening. She remembered watching him scribble furiously while she cleaned tables. She had thought he was writing reminders for himself. Instead, he had been writing the words that would eventually comfort millions of grieving strangers around the world. The attorney quietly paused the video. No one spoke. After nearly a minute, he opened one final folder. Unlike the others, this one contained no photographs, no newspaper articles, no contracts, only a single financial statement. He gently turned it toward Margaret. I've saved this for last. She adjusted her glasses again, then blinked. Once, twice, 3 times. The number refused to make sense. She counted the commas, then counted them again. Her breathing became shallow. This. She looked up in disbelief. This can't possibly belong to me. The attorney nodded. It does. For 28 years, every royalty payment that should have reached you was placed into a protected trust, exactly as Ethan instructed. The account continued growing. Albums, streaming, films, television, international licensing, charity performances. It never stopped. Margaret whispered the only words she could manage. How much? The attorney looked directly into her eyes, then answered quietly. Mrs. Collins, you're no longer wondering how you'll pay next month's bills. He paused, The account now exceeds $43 million. The room fell silent, but neither Margaret nor the attorneys realized that the greatest surprise of all was still waiting inside one final sealed envelope. A letter Ethan had written years earlier, knowing there was a very real chance he would never live long enough to thank the woman who had unknowingly saved his life. Margaret never reached for the financial statement again. $43 million. The number no longer mattered, not because it wasn't life-changing, but because, for the first time in nearly 30 years, she realized the greatest gift Ethan had left her could never be measured in dollars. It was something she had unknowingly been searching for ever since she locked the doors of her little cafe for the last time. Purpose! The attorney quietly removed one final item from his briefcase. Unlike the legal documents, unlike the royalty statements, this wasn't a contract. It was a single cream-colored envelope. The paper had softened with age, its edges worn from being handled countless times. Across the front, written in elegant handwriting, were only 4 words. For Margaret Collins, no law firm logo, no return address, just her name. He wrote this nearly 8 years ago, the attorney said softly. He updated his will several times afterward. But this letter, he paused. It's all. He never changed a single word. Margaret carefully broke the seal. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely unfold the pages inside. The first sentence blurred beneath tears before she even finished reading it. Dear Margaret, if this letter has reached you, then I'm sorry I wasn't able to thank you in person. She closed her eyes. His voice seemed to replace the printed words. She could almost hear the shy 18-year-old from that snowy winter speaking directly to her again. I've started this letter 100 times, he wrote. Every version sounded too small. How do you thank someone for giving you back your future? Margaret wiped away another tear. I've won awards. I've played sold-out stadiums. I've met presidents. I've traveled farther than that frightened kid standing in your cafe could ever have imagined. But none of those moments changed my life. You did. The room was silent except for the gentle rustling of paper. The attorneys didn't interrupt. Some stories deserved complete silence. I wasn't just hungry when I met you, Ethan continued. I was disappearing. Every foster home had taught me the same lesson. Don't expect anyone to stay. Don't expect kindness. Don't believe you're worth remembering. Margaret's breathing became uneven. She remembered how carefully he'd washed every plate, how he apologized whenever she offered him another helping, how he insisted on repairing broken shelves before accepting another night's sleep. Back then she thought he was simply polite. Now she understood. He had spent his childhood believing love always came with conditions. Until one woman proved otherwise. I thought you were feeding me because you felt sorry for me, the letter continued. It took me years to understand. You weren't feeding my stomach. You were feeding my hope. Margaret lowered the pages for a moment. Hope. Such a small word. Yet it had survived 28 years. The letter continued. Do you remember what you told me after I failed to finish that song? The people we lose don't disappear. They become part of every good choice we make afterward. I've spent my entire life trying to prove you were right. I've tried to become the kind of man your son would have been proud to meet. Margaret completely broke down. For years she had blamed herself for not saving Danny, for not saving her marriage, for losing the cafe. She believed life had reduced her existence to little more than surviving one lonely day after another. Now, for the first time, she saw something completely different. Danny hadn't disappeared. His kindness had lived on. First through her, then through Ethan, then through every stranger who found comfort in Ethan's music. One life had quietly become thousands. Thousands had become millions. The attorney finally spoke. You know, Ethan refused every request to reveal your identity. Margaret looked up. What? He always said the world already celebrated famous people. He smiled. But the people who quietly save lives, they're usually forgotten. He wanted the world to remember where miracles actually begin. Not on concert stages, not in recording studios, not beneath flashing cameras, but inside ordinary moments. A bowl of hot soup, an extra blanket, someone choosing to listen instead of looking away. Margaret looked around her tiny farmhouse. For years, she had seen nothing except peeling paint. Old furniture, bills stacked on the kitchen table, evidence of everything she'd lost. Now she saw something entirely different. This humble little home had become the place where the final chapter of one story and the first chapter of another had quietly begun. She folded Ethan's letter with extraordinary care and pressed it against her heart. The money would certainly change the rest of her life, but it wasn't the inheritance that transformed her. It was the realization that the smallest act of compassion, offered without expectation, could echo across decades, reach millions of strangers, and return one ordinary woman the one thing she thought she had lost forever, the certainty that her life had mattered all along. At that moment, Margaret made a silent promise. She would honor Ethan's gratitude, not by keeping what he had left behind, but by ensuring another frightened young soul would one day receive the same chance she had unknowingly given him on a freezing winter night nearly 3 decades earlier. For several minutes, no one said a word. The only sound inside the little farmhouse was the soft ticking of an old wall clock that had belonged to Margaret's late husband. $43 million. A letter that healed wounds almost 3 decades old. A promise that had crossed 28 years to find its way back to the woman who had unknowingly changed a life. It was more than anyone could process in a single afternoon. The attorney finally broke the silence. Mrs. Collins, Ethan anticipated exactly how you would react. Margaret looked up. What do you mean? He knew the first thing you'd say. She gave him a puzzled smile. And what was that? The attorney didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the briefcase one last time. Inside was a small leather journal. The cover was worn from years of travel. Across the front, embossed in fading gold letters, were 2 initials. W. Ethan kept this with him until the day he passed away. He wrote in it almost every week. He instructed us to give it to you only after you finished reading his letter. Margaret accepted the journal as though it were made of glass. Slowly, she opened to a page marked with a faded ribbon. The entry had been written nearly 10 years earlier. I finally understand something Margaret tried to teach me all those years ago. Kindness isn't a debt that should ever be repaid. It's a gift that must keep moving. If I ever find her, I already know she'll tell me she doesn't deserve the money. She's wrong. Margaret laughed softly through her tears. That sounds exactly like me. The attorney smiled. He knew you better than you realized. She lowered her eyes again. The next paragraph stopped her cold. If she insists the money belongs to someone else, tell her she's only half right. The money belongs wherever kindness has been forgotten. Margaret slowly closed the journal. For years, she had dreamed about what life would be like if she didn't have to worry about bills anymore. A new roof, reliable heat, maybe a small garden with enough room to grow vegetables. Nothing extravagant? She had never imagined having more money than she could spend in 10 lifetimes. Yet, standing there now, those dreams suddenly felt so small. She looked toward the kitchen window. Outside, snow had begun drifting gently across the old pasture. Children from the neighboring farm were laughing while trying to build a snowman. One little boy couldn't have been older than 15. He reminded her of Ethan. Thin, quiet, trying harder than everyone else. Without realizing it, Margaret whispered. How many are still out there? The attorney knew exactly what she meant. Thousands. Every year, thousands of teenagers age out of foster care. Many leave with no family. No permanent home. No one waiting. Some find their way. Many don't. Margaret felt her heart tighten. She remembered Ethan's frightened eyes. The way he had apologized before accepting a second bowl of soup. The way he had slept with one hand resting on his violin case, afraid someone might steal the only thing he had left. If she hadn't opened the cafe door that night, would anyone else have? She wasn't sure. The thought haunted her. The attorney slid another document across the table. This one wasn't a financial statement. It was a proposal. At the top were the words, "The Ethan Walker Legacy Initiative." He prepared this before his illness became serious. Margaret slowly turned the pages. Emergency housing, scholarships, mental health counseling, job training, musical education, mentorship. Every page outlined practical ways to help young adults leaving foster care begin independent lives with dignity instead of fear. But the final page was blank. Only one handwritten sentence appeared near the bottom. "I'd like Margaret to decide how the story continues." Her eyes filled again. "He trusted me with this. He trusted no one else." The attorney leaned forward. He believed the woman who saved one frightened teenager would know how to save many more. Margaret sat quietly. She looked around the tiny farmhouse. The peeling wallpaper, the worn wooden table, the old coffee mug still lying broken on the floor. This morning she had been wondering how she would survive another winter. Now she was being asked something infinitely greater. Not how to change her own life, but how to change the lives of countless strangers she had never met. For the first time since the attorneys arrived, certainty settled over her. She didn't need days to think. She didn't need financial advisors. She didn't need anyone to tell her what Ethan would have wanted. She already knew. Margaret gently placed both hands on the journal. Then she looked directly at the attorney. "I don't want people to remember Ethan because he became famous." She paused. "I want them to remember the scared young man who walked into a little cafe believing he didn't matter." Her voice grew steadier. "And I want every frightened young person who leaves foster care to hear the words someone once said to him." She smiled through her tears. "Sit down. You're safe here? We'll figure tomorrow out. Tomorrow." The attorney's eyes glistened. He quietly nodded. In that moment, everyone in the room understood something extraordinary. Ethan's greatest legacy had never been the millions of records he sold, nor the fortune he left behind. It was that, after 28 years, one simple act of kindness was about to become a movement, one that would ensure no frightened young soul would ever have to believe they were facing the world completely alone. The announcement came just 4 months later. Not from a recording studio, not from a television network, but from the old community center in Silver Creek, where folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows and homemade cookies sat beside coffee brewed by church volunteers. No celebrities, no flashing cameras, just ordinary people. The same kind of people Margaret had spent her entire life surrounded by. Yet, by the end of that afternoon, something extraordinary would begin. Margaret stood quietly behind the podium, smoothing the wrinkles from a navy blue jacket she hadn't worn in years. She hated public speaking. Always had. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the note cards she'd carefully written the night before. Across the room sat social workers, teachers, pastors, local business owners, and dozens of teenagers preparing to leave the foster care system. Some looked curious. Others looked skeptical. Most wore the same guarded expression Margaret had once seen on Ethan's face 28 years earlier. The expression of someone who had learned not to expect too much from life. The mayor stepped to the microphone. "Today," he announced, "Mrs. Margaret Collins is launching a foundation that will change the future of young people across our state." The audience applauded. Margaret slowly approached the podium. She looked down at her speech, then quietly folded the papers in half. She didn't need them. She already knew what she wanted to say. "When I was 41 years old," she began softly, "I believed my life was over." The room fell silent. I had buried the people I loved. I had lost almost everything I'd worked for. And every morning, I woke up wondering whether anything I did still mattered. She paused. Then one snowy evening, a hungry teenager walked into my little cafe. Several young people in the audience lifted their heads. I thought I was saving him. She smiled gently. It took me nearly 30 years to discover he had saved me too. There wasn't a sound in the room. No one reached for a phone. No one whispered. Every eye remained fixed on the elderly woman standing beneath the soft lights. Margaret continued. We spend so much of life believing that greatness belongs to famous people. People on television. People with money. People whose names everyone knows. She slowly shook her head. I've learned something different. The greatest moments in history often begin where nobody is watching. One conversation. One warm meal. One person deciding not to walk away. Several people wiped tears from their eyes. Near the back of the room, a teenage boy crossed his arms tightly across his chest, trying not to let anyone see that he was crying. Margaret noticed him immediately. He reminded her so much of Ethan, not because they looked alike, but because they carried the same loneliness. After the ceremony ended, volunteers greeted guests while reporters interviewed local officials. Margaret quietly slipped away from the crowd. She found the young man standing alone outside beneath a snow-covered pine tree. You heading home? She asked. He shrugged. Don't really have one. Margaret felt her heart ache. How old are you? 18. Last week. She nodded slowly. The same age. The same uncertainty. The same fear. He hesitated before speaking again. They told us your story inside. I don't think anyone ever talks like that anymore. Margaret smiled. What do you mean? He stared at the frozen ground. People usually ask what I've done wrong. You asked where I was going. There was a long silence. Finally, he whispered, I'm scared. The words were barely audible, but Margaret heard everyone. Without thinking, she reached into her purse. She removed a small brass key. It wasn't expensive. It belonged to the first apartment the foundation had renovated for young adults leaving foster care. Safe, warm, furnished, waiting. She placed the key in his hand. You won't be sleeping alone tonight. The teenager stared at it, then stared back at her. You don't even know me. Margaret smiled. I didn't know Ethan either. The young man's eyes filled with tears. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Across the parking lot, the attorney watched quietly. He smiled to himself. For a brief second, it felt as though history had folded back on itself. 28 years earlier, one frightened teenager had been handed a chance. Now another stood in exactly the same place. Only this time, Margaret wasn't acting out of grief. She wasn't trying to fill the emptiness left by loss. She had discovered something far greater. Helping people was no longer her way of surviving. It had become her purpose. Over the following year, the Margaret and Ethan Hope Foundation expanded far beyond anyone's expectations. Emergency housing became permanent housing. Scholarships became careers. Counseling became confidence. Young people who had once believed they were completely alone began mentoring others who arrived after them. Kindness was no longer a single act. It had become a chain that refused to break. Late one evening, after everyone had gone home, Margaret walked through the foundation's welcome center. Above the entrance hung a simple wooden sign. It displayed only one sentence, the same sentence that had unknowingly changed 2 lives decades earlier. You're safe here. We'll figure tomorrow out. Tomorrow? Margaret smiled as she switched off the lights. This time, she wasn't carrying grief into another lonely night. She was carrying hope. And for the first time in many years, hope was carrying her, too. 5 years passed. The seasons continued to change across Silver Creek. But one thing never did. Every morning, just before sunrise, Margaret unlocked the front doors of the Margaret and Ethan Hope Foundation before anyone else arrived. She insisted on doing it herself. Volunteers often offered to help. Staff members reminded her she was now in her 70s. She simply smiled. "This building was born because someone once opened a door for me," she would say. "I'll keep opening this one as long as I can." By then, the foundation had helped more than 3,000 young adults transition out of foster care. Some had become nurses. Others were teachers, electricians, firefighters, entrepreneurs, and musicians. Many returned not because they needed help anymore, but because they wanted to become the person they once wished had been waiting for them. The cycle of kindness had become stronger than anyone imagined. One crisp autumn afternoon, Margaret received an invitation she never expected. The National Center for Foster Youth had chosen to honor both her and Ethan with its highest humanitarian award. The ceremony would be broadcast live across the country. She almost declined. "I've never liked being in front of cameras," she laughed. "But," the attorney reminded her, "this isn't about cameras. It's about every young person who still believes no one sees them." Those words changed her mind. On the evening of the ceremony, the theater was filled with people from every walk of life. Government leaders, teachers, social workers, families, former foster youth, musicians whose lives had been inspired by Ethan's songs. When Margaret walked onto the stage, the audience rose to its feet. The standing ovation seemed endless. She looked overwhelmed, not because of the applause, but because, sitting in the front rows, she recognized dozens of familiar faces. Young men and women who had once entered the foundation frightened, homeless, and alone. Now they were successful adults, parents, professionals, community leaders, living proof that one opportunity could rewrite an entire future. As Margaret stepped toward the microphone, the applause finally faded. She looked across the room and smiled. "I've spent most of my life believing I had nothing extraordinary to offer." She paused. "I wasn't famous. I wasn't wealthy. I wasn't powerful. I was simply a woman who couldn't ignore a hungry teenager." Soft laughter rippled through the audience. Then her expression grew serious. "The world often tells us that changing lives requires extraordinary talent. It doesn't. It requires ordinary people making extraordinary choices." The audience grew completely silent. Margaret reached into her purse. From inside, she carefully removed the faded paper napkin Ethan had carried for nearly 3 decades. The room leaned forward. "This napkin," she said, holding it gently between trembling fingers, "was never supposed to become history. It was simply a young man writing down words he was afraid he might forget." She smiled through tears. "But kindness has a remarkable memory. It remembers long after we think the moment has passed." She carefully placed the napkin back into its protective case. "I used to believe that our lives are measured by what we accomplish." She slowly shook her head. "I don't believe that anymore. I believe our lives are measured by the number of people who sleep peacefully because we chose to care." A tear rolled down her cheek. "So tonight, if you remember anything I've said, remember this. You may never write a hit song. You may never stand on a stage. You may never become famous. But somewhere, someone is praying for the kind of kindness that only you can give." For several seconds, no one applauded. Many couldn't. They were crying. Then, from the back of the theater, a young man slowly stood. He had once been the first resident of the Foundation's housing program. Margaret had handed him a brass key on a snowy afternoon years earlier. Now he walked onto the stage carrying a small velvet box. He stopped in front of Margaret. "You once told me, you're safe here." He smiled. "You probably don't remember." Margaret laughed softly through her tears. "I remember." He opened the box. Inside was a beautifully crafted silver key. Unlike an ordinary key, this one couldn't unlock any door. Its surface was engraved with a single sentence. "One open door can change the world." The audience erupted into applause. There wasn't a dry eye in the theater. The young man turned toward the crowd. "I used to think I was the luckiest person she ever helped." He smiled. "I was wrong. Looking across the audience, he continued, "We're all the lucky ones." He gestured toward the hundreds of former foster youth filling the seats. Because one woman decided that compassion was more important than convenience. The applause grew louder than before. As Margaret looked around the theater, she imagined Ethan smiling somewhere beyond the lights. Not because people were celebrating his music, not because they remembered his fame, but because the promise he had made as a frightened 18-year-old had finally been fulfilled. A single bowl of hot soup, a warm place to sleep, a few words spoken with genuine love, had become homes, scholarships, second chances, and thousands of new beginnings. And as the audience rose once more in a thunderous standing ovation, Margaret understood the greatest truth of her life. Legacies are never built by the moments the world applauds. They are built by the quiet moments when no one is watching. The moments when one ordinary person chooses to become the miracle someone else has been waiting for. Some stories end with fame. Others end with fortune. But the most meaningful stories end with a simple reminder that every human life has the power to change another. Margaret never imagined that one warm meal, one spare room, and a few encouraging words would echo across nearly 3 decades. She wasn't trying to make history. She wasn't looking for recognition. She simply chose compassion when it would have been easier to look away. That's the lesson this story leaves behind. We often underestimate the impact of ordinary kindness because we rarely get to see how far it travels. A smile offered to someone who feels invisible. A conversation with a person who has lost hope. A second chance given to someone the world has already judged. These moments may seem small today, but they can become the turning point in someone else's entire future. Not everyone will become a world-famous musician like Ethan. Not everyone will inherit millions like Margaret. But every one of us will eventually face a moment when another person quietly needs our help. In that moment, we have a choice. We can walk away, or we can become the reason someone believes in humanity again. Perhaps the greatest legacy we leave behind isn't the money we earn, the awards we win, or the success we achieve. Perhaps it's the people who live better lives because we chose to care when no one else did. And maybe, years from now, someone you may never meet will be telling a story that began with one small act of kindness you almost didn't make. Call to action, CTA. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more powerful, true-to-life stories that remind us of the incredible impact one person can have. Now, we'd love to hear from you. Has someone ever changed your life with one simple act of kindness, or have you been that person for someone else? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly the encouragement someone else needs today. And remember, never underestimate the power of a single act of compassion. The life you change tomorrow may one day come back to change the world.